Hi, this is a little video just to advertise a webinar I'm doing in a couple of days' time with Thanuja at Wisdom Exchange. So this is going to be broadcast in Australian Eastern Time, and the link will be in the comments below when I've posted the video. So we want to just chat a little bit about the power of systemic osteopathy. My name's Caroline Stone. I've been hanging around the osteopathy scene for 40 years now. So I've seen a lot come and go, but what I do know is that osteopathy is more than just biomechanics and back pain. I'm sorry, but it is. I know. Actually, I'm making no apologies for wanting to talk about the power of systemic osteopathy. We are health seekers. We seek health with others. We do things in combination with people, not to people, and we help to improve their health, their agency. We're about salutogenesis. We're not about disease. And there's lots of things that we can talk about. So I'm just going to flip through a few things. Ultimately, health, cellular action, osteopathy at the most critical levels. How do we access our mitochondria? How do we know that our techniques on the outside are really operating on the fundamental principles of how health is maintained in the body? Well, it's not as tricky as you think. Let's pick a region. We'll take thoracic biomechanics. How do we go from just knowing that the rib cage is a cage? It's more than a cage, but how do we go from that to looking at the chest function within? How do the functions of the chest either conflict or complement each other? And how do we get from understanding pump handle stuff and the anatomy of the ligaments of the costotransverse joints and costovertebral joints? How do we know that in terms of how do we go from understanding variability and rib loading to all sorts of techniques that have been developed over the years? How do we do that to know that we can influence various reflex phenomena, various spinal reflex arcs, various ganglia, various mechanics of the spinal column, not just lymph, but obviously intraspinal column circulation with the azygous system of veins, Baxus venous plexus, the CSF that's flowing all down the dural and membranous systems, even into the central canal of the thoracic spinal cord. What's going on there when you just move your vertebral column around? How does that movement intracolumnar, inside the column movement, how does it influence that CSF and venous pressuring? How does that influence the theoretical dynamics of the reciprocal tension membrane? How does it influence CSF up and down the flow? How do we get into the head? By working on the spine. How do we understand three-dimensional whole body movements? How do we know that when we walk and when we work with the thoracic rib cage and the dorsal lumbar junctions and the axial appendicular dynamics, how do we know that relates into circulatory dynamics, flow dynamics? How do we really think about our understanding of global spinal column, three-dimensional postural gravitational sway? How do we think that influences things in humans, not animals? What's our version when we're upright, gravitationally organized? How does gait relate to lobe function? Why are the fissures where they are? What's that alignment got to do with health? How can we understand what we're feeling on the outside? And how do we transpose that to what we're feeling on the inside? How do we know the old osteopathic perspectives about posture and arches and curves and pivots and triangles? Where does that come from? What's it trying to show us? Is it trying to show us how, when we're upright and when we move along, when we have oscillatory gait, that we're actually pumping and squeezing our lungs, yes, but also our heart, yes, but also our liver? How do we know then that when we work through the diaphragm that we're actually not influencing all this visceral physiology, the dynamics of peritoneal fluid flow, the transmural pressures of the abdomen? This is the sort of thing that we need to be thinking about. You can't do anything in osteopathy if you're not three-dimensional, multi-layered, and in fact, multi-dimensional in your thinking. How do we go from thinking about the diaphragm to understanding appositional dynamics in physiology? How do we know this space? How do we know that it's filled with lungs? What about the lymph in there? How do we look at lobular perfusions? How do we look at lung function tests? How do we look at the expansion and contraction of the lungs and what it means in health and dysfunction? How do we understand that to do with perfusion and exchange and fluid blood flow in the lungs? How does that relate to cardiac function? How do we understand breathlessness? How do we look at the mechanics of the rib cage and into the metabolic dynamics at the cellular level? How do we link cellular respiration back to cardiorespiratory cycling? How do we understand vagal tone and pulmonary responsivenesses to cardiac output? How do we take techniques in children and understand the dynamics of pediatric anatomy in the chest? How do we look at baroreceptors and carotid receptors and the development of all of those dynamics? How do we understand absolutely what the Moro reflex is all about? How do we know how our work when we touch onto the chest is to do with autonomics, arousal, movement, and somatic integrity? How do we then really think about the heart in there? It's not just the diaphragm, it's the heart and all sorts of things. And what do we know about the electrical function of the heart? What do we know about what we can palpate of the electrical function of the heart? How do we understand how the heart works? It's not a pump, it's so much more. How do we understand electromagnetic charge, the hemodynamics? How do we understand the electrical currents that pass through us? How do we understand fourth phases of water? And how do we understand all of this charged being phenomena with respect to our mind and our body and our biosphere? And how do we get then from putting our hands on the ribs to putting our hands on all of the bioenergy fields that are in there and the physiological flow and the movement of fluids, flow, electrons and dynamics? How do we understand, how do we get from that to all of the spiritual, energetic or religious aspects of osteopathic practice? And how do we interact with it during hands in or hands off or hands hovering around the edges? I mean, how do we think about these things? Because osteopathy is so much more than understanding the biomechanics of the costal articulations, the facet joints, what's happening with the discs and pain medicine. It's about mindfulness. Is what's the concept of the midline? How do we use meditation? What is osteopathy? Is it visualization? Is it interaction? Is it how much mutual co-regulation is in there? You know, and what about right down at the quantum level? I mean, is the body symmetrical? I just really don't think it is. And even quantum manifestations, fundamentally, when they're applied to biological organisms, they're not symmetrical either. And so there's all sorts of really curious things when we think about osteopathic phrases like the rule of the artery. And is it really the rule of fluids? And is it really to do with the fact that when it comes to biology and consciousness, we should be asymmetric, not symmetric? What does that mean to our heart-brain connectedness? What does that mean to where our soul is and our higher power is? And, you know, why do some people think CSF is so intriguing? Why is it more than any other fluid? And I don't think it is. I think it's a fluid. I think all other fluids are equally higher. How do we use our hands? How do we get from these thinking, seeing, feeling fingers to understand what's actually happening with all of these little neurons? How do we know that what we're feeling, how that goes up into our somatosensory cortex? How do we know that that's a lot to do with how 80 Still was guiding us to understand it's an interpretative, internalizing phenomena of seeing? It's a paradigm of seeing. It's a philosophical approach, which is much more to do with a Goethean approach, a morphological approach. It's to do with the growth of the practitioner. It's patient-centered, yes, but even more importantly, it's practitioner-centered. How do we go from understanding this when we put our hands on the rib cage, that osteopathy is not a cognitive thing, it's not biomechanical, it's somatophysiological, and it leads to health. And this is the power of systemic osteopathy. And come and watch the webinar where we can spend a few hours going through all these things. See you there.